actually being live. I'll get ready to play music.
Cool.
I think I might even put it.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, guys.
You can
Hey,
see
Welcome.
you're in the right place. This is Joe Firestone, and this is MMT in the Public Purpose. And I'm here with Lisa Theobald, who's my co host. Our guest for tonight is Jonathan Wilson. Jonathan is an independent researcher. He's an attorney, and he's very, very good, okay, at MMT writing.
happy to be back.
And thank you, Jonathan, for coming. I'm so glad you've come back.
Great to have you, Jonathan.
So let's get into the subject matter of steady state interest rate dynamics. First of all, what do we mean by steady state interest rate dynamics?
It's a good question. So, steady state interest rate dynamics is in contrast to the dynamics of changing interest rates, right? So, steady state interest rate dynamics asks the question, what will happen if interest rates remain at a particular level for a given period of time, which is in contrast to variable rate interest rate dynamics, which asks the question, what will happen if you increase rates or decrease rates? And it sounds like the same thing, but the distinction here is that you can have interest rates that are very high, 20%, 30%, and be decreasing them. So you will be gaining some effect of sort of a downward variable rate, if you're moving from 25% down to 20%, but you are still within the high range because 20% is still high historically. Historically, interest rates have been, for the past 200 years between 3 and 10%. So these countries like Angola and Turkey that have 15%, 20% interest rates, those are all high interest rate countries, regardless of whether or not they are currently decreasing. And then on the flip side, it's true, you can have sort of increasing interest rate dynamics, even though interest rates remain low. So if you're at 0 or 1%, those are low interest rates, and there will be a certain effect if you increase interest rates from 2 to 3 or 4, but you are still in the low range, and there are certain effects from being in that low range that you would expect to happen regardless of whether or not interest rates are going up or staying still.
Okay. So why is that subject matter area important?
That subject matter is important because this is sort of related to one of the core MMT propositions regarding sort of what interest rates do and whether or not we should be gearing our economic recovery and management around managing interest rates. And if you, it's important because one of the main things that MMT co-founders Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, and L. Randall Wray point out is that increasing the risk-free rate of interest gives money to people who already have it, and that alone should be a reason why we should be skeptical of using increasing rates as a means of controlling the economy or controlling inflation. One of the other reasons is that when interest rates are high for a very long time, there are, lots of negative effects. And MMT and mainstream economists disagree greatly on what the negative effects of having high interest rates for a long period of time are. One of the effects that I like to point out most that I think is a relatively unique claim. I might not be the first to sort of say this is important, but I think I'm, one of the people, at least in the MMT community, who makes the biggest deal out of this, is that in developing nations, when you have high interest rates for a long time, what that does is it discourages borrowing from the perspective of the borrower, because it discourages borrowing in the currency that has the high rates. So in my Turkey article, which I believe we discussed in a prior episode, we talked about how for the last 15 years, interest rates on loans in Turkish lira have been significantly higher by 6 or 7, sometimes 10 percentage points higher than similar loans in either dollars or euro. And what that means is that if you're living in Turkey, you don't want to borrow in lira because that is going to cost you more. What you want to do is you want to borrow in dollars and euro because that is a cheaper loan. And the empirical data backs this up. There have been studies that look at various countries and say, oh yeah, people want to borrow with a cheaper rate. And what that means is that people, if they're borrowing in a foreign currency, they are accumulating liabilities in that currency. And the more liabilities your private sector has in foreign currency, the less need they have for the domestic currency. And this creates some really sort of serious implications for exchange rate dynamics, which then will pass through into inflation, if the country is vulnerable to that sort of pass through.
So tell us, what are some of the effects of the exchange rates dynamics
Yeah.
that
So
can result from this?
yeah, when a country has a lot of private sector foreign denominated debt because domestic interest rates were so high, it actually creates a vulnerability to deficit spending in the economy. If the government spends more money than it takes out and the private sector doesn't need that money as much as they need foreign money, dollars and euros, they will sell the domestic money to get dollars and euros. That pushes the rate of exchange down, meaning that if you wanted to buy something using your domestic money, using your Turkish lira, you would have to pay more for it because, if you are an importer who, needs to buy, wheat to make bread or whatever, and you have lira and the exchange rate just went down, you have to spend even more lira and you have to recoup that cost somehow and you have to pass it on to your customers. So that's one way that high rates can lead directly to lower foreign exchange value, and then pass directly into domestic prices.
And since this also causes the domestic economy to, it constrains the policy space they have for deficit spending. It also means that the governments, okay, of the developing nations have a harder time compensating for business cycles.
That's right. That's exactly right. Because they, ideally, in a recession, they want to be able to, sort of give people money to support their income. Uh, but if the money is being devalued and more people sort of are preferring the foreign currency, it sort of creates this snowball type effect. The other aspect of it is that, if you look sort of, literally at what interest rates are doing, even from the mainstream perspective, but just with a little bit more nuance, they say that, oh, if you raise rates, that'll slow down the economy. But if you look at it with this nuance, considering currency competition, you realize what it's doing is that it's slowing down a particular type of economic activity, which is the domestic currency economic activity, meaning that if there is going to be economic activity, more and more of it is going to be taking place in foreign currency, which means that foreign investors are going to have more of an influence on what's going on in that country.
Okay, so in relation to Turkey, has this had effects on the development of Turkey in terms of slowing it down over a period of time?
Uh, a little bit, I think. What we have seen growth and sort of deficit spending in Turkey, but you've also seen, um, you know, these large amounts of private sector debt. You know, uh, a lot of sort of foreign investors sort of moving into Turkey. Um, I'll have to do a bit more research to get a bigger picture on sort of the exact speed of that, because I know that they have been trying to fight back a little bit. Last year Erdogan had some sort of initiative to bring back some domestic manufacturing to Turkey, um, but my understanding is that there had been sort of less of that sort of controlled by sort of local investors.
The kind of research that you do is empirical research, right?
For the most part, yeah, I try to. What I like to do is I do a combination of sort of like looking at data and then also looking at news articles. If you go through the Turkey piece, there are a lot of articles that are linked that are written in Turkish magazines and newspapers that you can use Google Translate to see what they were saying in English. But I'm trying to I try to establish sort of empirical timelines, sort of like piecing through what happened by listening to what people were actually saying at the time about what their motivations were for selling domestic currency or buying foreign currency or for making this particular type of investment decision, rather than looking at a model and trying to impose that model's understanding onto what you're seeing. That's how you lose that nuance with regards to the sort of domestic versus foreign currency competition.
You're right. So this in itself uh, is a difference from a lot of mainstream economics that tries to use abstract models
I
and
think, yeah, I would agree with
that
that.
models onto data.
Yeah, I think you have to look at data and narratives first, and then try to come up with an explanation as to why um, one narrative led to the other. And if that ends up aligning with some aspect of a model that you had previously developed, that's great. But I think you should. At least my approach is to always come with as much skepticism as possible.
Okay, so I think I
Awesome.
led you away from the central themes of the paper. So I'd like to now take you back to some of the central themes of the paper.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let's talk about sort of the distinction between what I like to call the low for long steady state and the high for long steady state. So the low
Yeah.
for long steady state is what happens when interest rates are below average for an extended period of time, so multiple years, right? And the high for long steady state is what happens when interest rates are above average for multiple years and remain that way for multiple years.
Okay, now in terms of the United States, of course, we have had very low interest rates for multiple years.
Long
Yeah,
time.
you could say that the U.S. and Japan, yeah, definitely parts of Europe, um, has had the low for long steady state for at least you know decades, and it's true in some places as other places as well. Sort of, excuse me, relative to regional expectations. Africa, in most countries in Africa, Nigeria, Angola tend to have higher interest rates than average, but there are certain places where if you just look at the regional average, there are countries such as South Africa that have had sort of the African regional equivalent of the low for long steady state for many
Okay.
years. In South Africa, I think interest rates have been between 6 and 10 for most of the last 20 years or so, whereas places like Angola, it's been in between 10 and 20 for much longer periods.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of nuance you can get in there as well. And that could be the subject of a much sort of larger research paper, trying to break it down and trying to figure out really sort of what the impacts of these things are within um, regional economies. Anyway, we got off topic a little bit, but so the low for long steady state is what MMT advocates because it avoids a number of issues. The first being sort of the inequality issue of giving money to people who already have money. The second being, it does not encourage foreign debt, foreign private debt. The third being that it sorry it allows domestic investment. Um,
Hmm.
the mainstream consensus is that the low for long steady state is undesirable for a number of reasons. The main two are that they believe it promotes financial instability and that it can and usually does promote inflation. And if you dig into the papers where they write about why this is the case, in the article I link to the Blanchard paper as well as a couple of others. They say very explicitly that this is because, you know, when interest rates remain low, it's because the central bank is supplying the economy with non-interest bearing reserves, or because the treasury is minting additional seniorage revenue, and that is adding to the money supply. And if you look at their explanation, they tell you very explicitly when it does this, you will have a one for one sort of increase to the price level, proportionally, with the new money. So, in other words, even though mainstream economists will say things occasionally, they'll pay lip service to the idea that they don't believe in a strict quantity of money theory type relationship between prices and the money supply. You know, their models are telling them that they should expect this relationship to hold. And it's fascinating to me that they sort of like bury the lead with this occasionally. I can't. That's the part of it I can't explain. Is like why aren't they more upfront about this in their press releases and their sort of more sort of popular writing, that's not in the academic papers. I think it's because they know it the effect is, I think in their mind they think the effect is either difficult to reconcile with like the lags. That's probably the way they would explain it. Of course, the way MMTers would explain it was that the quantity money theory isn't true because of the propensity to save and the sort of disaggregated effect of one type of spending on prices versus another, and also MMT's emphasis on looking at the price of consumer goods specifically and not worrying as much about asset price inflation. I think mainstream economists tend to be a little bit more worried about asset price inflation because their clients are a bit more worried about asset price inflation.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
that's it, right? That is it. It's the people who have money, and they keep looking. They look at that from up here, as opposed to, because that is their power structure. That is the corporate investment capitalization sphere. Never down. Down on the bottom, they look at it from the standpoint of, well, we've got to raise interest rates to slow the economy down. What they don't
Mhm.
say is that, that will cause people who do not have money to have less money, and the ripple effect of that, right?
Right.
Companies that, and that causes the constraint, the contraction, which causes layoffs. But everybody sitting pretty who has money in their pockets is going to do really well. And I'll just throw this on top as icing. I'm very concerned about interest rates going up right now because we have a lot of people with unprecedented amounts of money.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If it'll, it's that inequality we were talking about, and it relates back to this concept of price versus affordability. If the price of a house goes down, but interest rates go up, then affordability hasn't gone up. Affordability might even go down if, in addition to rates going up, employment goes down and wages go down. And what does that mean? It means the people who can pay in cash, the people who, like you said, Lisa, already have a lot of money, the BlackRocks of the world, you know, can buy houses, and people who don't have money, who would have had to borrow, won't be able to. Um, yeah, so that's another sort of important ideological distinction, which I didn't get into as much in that particular article, but I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it a little bit right here. Um, anyway, so prices and financial stability. Um, Mainstream economists have this idea that if we do not give investors money for free, they will do risky things that will destroy the economy.
They're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have to tell you too much about it. You already know, Lisa. You've seen how financial departments at some of these companies operate. They will take risks. Even if you're giving them free money. The biggest example of this, and I love to hear your thoughts on this, is that even during the financial crisis, I'm sorry, in the lead up to the financial crisis, we had rates that were much higher than they were now, but people still felt the need to gamble on these mortgage-backed securities because, as I write in the piece, it doesn't matter if you give someone a free, 10% on a treasury bond if they think they can get a free 15 or 20% on, these collateralized debt obligations.
They'll go for the free 15 or 20%.
And
Time.
it absolutely every time, right? And I think it's also important to point out this major disconnect between operating up in the monetary levers that we can pull on interest rates and how that, from a high level capital standpoint, macro functioning private economy, that's one thing. But when you get down into the mortgage business, the banking business, the marketing, the product development, okay? Those folks are churning out products with a acceptable amount of risk, or a amount of risk that they can talk their business leaders, their financial departments, and then eventually the board into being willing to take. But these guys down here that are developing these products, they don't understand all of this. That's not their job. Their job is to come up with a way to
Mm-hmm.
underwrite a product that's going to, put your model together, show me the projections. What's your marketing? What's the demographic for this? Why do you think this is going to be a go? Package it up, pitch it. I mean, we were churning out predatory loans for a while, and somebody came up with the idea to put the derivatives on them under and package them and sell them off. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They went in and pitched that for damn near a year, every quarter. And finally, somebody said, fine, do it. Because after a while, it started looking like, well, how are we going to leave this money lying on the table? And all it took was one bad quarter where we were going to miss the street for them to say, we need a lever to pull. Bingo, do this. And then we were off to the races.
Wow. See, that part I didn't know about. See, I knew that they could create these risky products and pitch them as being safe. I didn't realize that there was sort of this internal resistance that, the people pitching the products even internally sort of went out of their way to overcome. They were saying,
my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
That's how they made their money. That's how they made their bonuses. That's how they climbed the ladder.
Yeah, sure. It was based on the sales.
Yes.
Yes.
So there isn't like this grand.
The more they made, they got very, very rich.
Yeah, the decision making is not a one-way street. That is the dynamic that is so scary to me, because you can have economists and, politicians do this kind of stuff, but there is a major disconnect in implementation, and we are deregulated to the point where it is, I don't know if it's, I don't even know what to do to bring it back quickly enough, because that's the only thing that controls it.
See, that's so importantly true. The point about regulations, because that's one of the things I talk about in the paper, is that if you want to prevent, dangerous risk-taking financial instability from happening, you need regulations. You don't just promise people money and hope that you've rewarded them properly. And we used to have much stronger financial regulations in this country, and there was a lot of sort of deregulation under, well, first under Milton Friedman, but then under Ben Bernanke as well, saying that he thought that the financial market would regulate itself, which is a key principle
in terms of the politics, though. Deregulation started under Jimmy Carter. Okay, and it accelerated under Reagan.
Yeah, but then it kept going, right?
Kept going.
And deregulation,
ideological thing.
It takes a while for that deregulation and that loosey-goosey, let's try this, let's try that, going down into the, fair-haired golden kids that are the new kids on the block, that are innovative, that are pitching things to their senior vice presidents, right? That culture shift takes a little bit, not as long as people think, but it does take a while. But boy, when it takes off, boom. 2003, we were good. 2004, people started grumbling. Well, this might get a little sketchy, right? Took till 2008 before it went bust.
Yeah.
It started going bust in 2007. That's actually when the housing crisis started. And then that spread into the rest of the economy in 2008. But to speak about the young people, and the whiz kids who accelerated this. Okay, in the latter 90s, some young people came in with mathematical models that were used as a guide to packaging the CDOs, and CDSs, and some 4 of them went into a business known as long-term capital management. In the latter part, the 1990s, they were hot. They were so well thought of by everybody. They're thought of as as brilliant kids. Kids not so far out of school,
Hmm.
and they were brilliant. From the intelligence standpoint, and of course nobody understood their models because the models were the product of brilliant people.
Exactly. They're pitching to their bosses, and their bosses are just like, "Really? This is going to work? What do you think? What do you think?" Okay.
Mm.
So the point is, I guess, the real world disappointed the models, and the
Every time.
packages began to collapse because these were not empirical researchers.
Exactly.
Whereas they
That's just
developed,
it.
these abstract mathematical models, and then people on Wall Street basically followed the models and constructed their packages, according to the dictates of the models. Okay. At
Well,
one
people
point,
on Wall Street had these new markets now for these securitized mortgages, right? I mean, again, you got to get out of the think tank room up top that actually understands like the empirical ideas and models here and data. And you've got to push it down into implementation and what happens in your sales rooms and what happens on your brokerage in your brokerage houses, because that is way far removed, right? And it is so deregulated, truthfully, that you cannot trust that people are going to do the right thing, because honestly, there's a lot of them don't even understand what the right thing to do is. Even the guy that was coming around appraising houses, right? Basing it off the last 3 sales of, your comps. All of it, well, okay, well, that last comp went for this much money, and this one over here the other day went for this much money, and this one's a 2-bedroom and this one's a 3-bedroom, but hell, it's on the same block. Boom, they're valuing everything at the same amount of money, and it just goes like this, right? There's a lot of levels of actual market gain that is going to behoove someone in a different vein in business. They don't understand all this up here.
Exactly. And MMT is like to stress sort of the importance of those decisions that are sort of shaped by regulation as being the actual solution to the perceived fear of the low for long steady state. If you're afraid of people gambling under low interest rates, then you increase regulations. You don't hike interest rates because that'll cause the other problems.
Exactly.
And at least
Say that
I'm
again,
curious
Jonathan. Jonathan, say it again. Say that one more time for everybody in the back.
if
yes,
you want if you want to prevent speculation, you regulate it. You don't hike rates because that'll cause all sorts of problems. It might not even stop the speculation. Um,
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Lisa and Joe, you guys have been involved in this for a bit longer than I. I'm curious as to if you had, sort of your sort of favorite, potential regulation to enact or even or bring back that would have prevented some of the things we saw in the 2000s.
well, it wasn't so much
Interesting.
actually specific things. I was familiar with Warren's work on trying to regulate certain financial aspects um, in terms of asset requirements for the banks, as opposed to having essentially reserve requirements. He would talk about how Canada basically had zero requirements, for reserves, but their banks were much sounder in terms of the capital requirements that they had to have. And one
Okay, so
point,
I'm
huh?
chomping at the bit. I'm chomping at the bit with this one, Joe, because it applies. W- We need
Let's
to
hear it.
Go ahead.
separate out the mortgage banking from the deposit banking. Okay. That was the worst thing. Glass-Steagall needs to come back in. And then I'm going to go really big and broad here because it's ridiculous. Antitrust, where the hell is the SEC? Where in the hell is the SEC. Now I know,
Yeah.
same place the FDA and the EPA are, right? Underfunded, understaffed.
But also, people often forget that one of the major functions of the Fed was supposed to be to regulate the banks, and they were doing very little regulation. They failed, okay, in the regulatory function.
As long as they didn't have to bail out a deposit walk or run, they stayed out of it.
Right, but of course, they did have to start to bail out uh, the
One
banking
bank,
industry.
mine, one, and they sold it off to Jamie Dimon.
Right, and they sold it
One.
off to Jamie Dimon, but then they started to having to bail out banks en masse. Basically, all the big banks were saved in 2009, in 2010.
From
There,
brokering deals to sell them to one another.
now, there was a study done, by Randy's graduate students, some of his graduate students, uh, and I guess he was involved as well. And the study broke in 2011 or 2012. Okay, I recall. And the Federal Reserve had advanced credit facilities to the major banks at that time in the amount of $29 trillion. It wasn't
You're
even once. It was basically revolving.
11. You're in 2011, right, Joe?
Yeah, 2010
Okay.
and 2011. The study was done, I think, at the end of 2011 or something like that. By that time, the amount of credit they had extended was up to 29 trillion,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't stop there. I mean, I don't know what the final figure was. It kept on going. I don't know when they stopped actually extending credit to banks in this way, in order to try to ensure liquidity. That's the way they looked at it. It was a liquidity problem.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to provide essentially whatever liquidity the banks happened to need. And so they did this and did this and did, until this, until arbitrage. Okay, in other words, the banks were basically borrowing money at zero interest or close to zero interest. And their credit departments were, of course, the credit card departments were charging customers on the average 18%, 19%, 20%. I mean, that's a margin of 20%, gross profit margin.
Yeah.
20%, okay, on those loans. That was not regulated at all. Not at all. Okay, and the Federal Reserve, of course, hasn't performed hardly any regulation of banks to this day. Its division devoted to regulation is just now starting to get active.
Well, and then let's just insert in here what the ACA did to the insurance industry, which has probably more money or just about the same amount of money as banks, and they've got no collateral requirements. I mean, there have been so many things that have happened since 2010. The amount of deregulation, the corporations being able to, become people, the underwriting and things that people don't even realize yet that have yet to be challenged in the courts associated with the fact that corporations now can do things and have the same rights as people. When we used to be protected from corporations, right?
Yeah, Lisa, can you expand on that? Are you saying that under the ACA, insurance companies can borrow money without posting collateral from?
No,
Yeah.
it's not because they're not banks, okay? But try and get your head around the idea that every single person in the United States or every single individual that is covered under a plan, okay, you're prepaying your premiums. A lot of federal subsidies are coming in behind that, right, to the insurance industry. You've got the insurance industry, in most part, owning the distribution line of your health care, right? They own the brick and mortar. They sign contracts with the doctors. They're their employees. They underwrite the insurance plans that put you into networks that can do things like deny you care, deny you medications, kick you off your insurance, on your insurance, off your insurance, make you switch, la la la. You cannot just rely on being able to go to a doctor that you have had as a primary care physician for a long time and have some continuity of, hey, I need treated, right? They have new formulary protocols that take people off of their drug treatments that they've been on stable for years because they change a formulary. All of these things are done to keep the premiums and the subsidies, because the more of that they keep, the less they're going to put out, because it's an insurance underwriting, right?
Right.
So the hoarding, the sheer hoarding of money, I mean, they profit off of it, and there's a lot of people getting kickbacks from it, and a lot of people on the payroll because of it. However, you see the billions and billions of dollars of profits. They've conglomerated into monopolies. Insurance companies own pharma, and this one over here, the pharma owns the insurance entities, right? Which own the regional underwriting, and they literally own the brick and mortar. Their doctors and nurses they've signed over their billing rights to the insurance conglomerate that owns the entire distribution chain. So they are regulated much like banks, except they're not lending anything. They don't have any lending requirements. They don't have any capital requirements per se, because they don't have to worry about assets they need to back up. They're not serving the public. They're denying them care. But the sheer amount of money that is flowing through that has them regulated, if there is any such real teeth in any of it anymore, aligned with banks from the standpoint of the sheer volume of money flowing through there.
Yeah, let's relate this and sort of relate it back and sort of combine it with our discussion of the bailouts of financial institutions that occurred, during the Great Recession. I think what we're finding in common between these two instances in which you're seeing money being given to these institutions, and while allowing them to be deregulated is it exemplifies sort of one of the tenets of neoliberalism that sort of undergirds some of their models and their analysis and their empirical assumptions, which is essentially this idea that the private profit makers, people who are really good at accumulating, hoarding this wealth, are the people who are best equipped to be making as many decisions as possible about the economy. And I think that sort of line of thinking is rampant at the SEC, at some of these regulatory institutions, at the central bank, and at the economic departments of a lot of universities. And that's why when MMTPP talk about, oh no, just regulate them, they say no, don't regulate them. Just give them more money, essentially, because they think that's the best way for things to move forward. And even if they don't, they're incentivized to say that they are. Because
Exactly.
if you are a regulator or a professor, and you're teaching, the appropriate neoliberal precepts, that's how you get speaking appearances at, JP Morgan, that, people like Larry Summers have, been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, for an hour of their time. That's how you, get, senior vice president positions at
Goldman Sachs.
At Goldman Sachs, all these places, if you keep towing this line, there are great incentives for you. And I can see how, a person getting into that position who, even if they came to it from a point of neutrality, would see themselves sort of pulled into like, okay, well, maybe this is the way we should do it. And they sort of keep pushing and keep pushing. And the more they're sort of isolated from the real economy, sort of the more time they spend either in academia or in one of these financial institutions, the harder it is for them to see sort of the negative impacts or the lack of fairness associated with these.
Yeah, right, because they're not looking for the negative impacts.
Exactly. They're looking for, is it increasing GDP, which is really just, is it increasing corporate profits, which is really, is it helping my company or my friend's company?
Welcome to FP&A.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You know who's the offset to FP&A? Your auditors, your accountants.
For the listeners who don't know what FP&A stands for, why don't you help them out, Lisa?
Financial planning and analysis, the good old GE crew.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on them?
GE, we bring good things to life. While they basically were responsible for Hanford in Washington State. And if you don't know about Hanford in Washington State, look it up. It is a nuclear disposal site and a nuclear development site, but not necessarily done well at all. Washington Mutual Bank, 10 years before it went under, before it went run amok, literally, was infused by GE FP&A guys that came in and were basically first vice presidents and ran the departments, created all of these products that helped in the demise of the mortgage-backed securities, okay? And they've gone into many, many different sectors. Like it for a very long time. What was his name? Was his name Walsh? Who was the head of GE in the 80s and 90s? 80s.
I don't remember exactly.
Chainsaw Al?
I don't know. But anyhow, I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but I can see his face clear as day. Anyway, they were a big group of, let's just say, business gods, okay, that did all kinds of models, financial modeling. They did come up with like the production line, Six Sigma, product tolerances that made a production line run really, really well. But you see, America doesn't produce things anymore. We offshored most of that, right? So what happened when we converted into a service industry where we were producing services instead of actually production line product? Well, where'd all these GE guys go? GE Locomotive is no longer here, right? I mean, I can go on and on with this, but your actual heavy manufacturing and things that just like got scaled back and scaled back and scaled back. And you had all these executives from GE that sort of ended up getting dispersed out into financial services and other sectors. But financial services, we were a big one. And we were so excited to have these FP&A guys from GE come in. And what ended up happening was that there was a lot of there that didn't translate. So we had kind of like no there. We tried to back engineer Six Sigma into the financial services world, which just basically meant that you figured out how to do workflow effectively. Are your internal processes in your corporation running effectively? Well, okay, yeah. They kind of missed the idea of training your human capital to their strengths or to their weaknesses and capitalizing on their strengths and empowering them to do well with the right kind of management and supervision. So you had some control over what was going on. They sort of missed that altogether because they were running production lines, right?
Yeah.
So it just missed.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. This idea of sort of investing in human capital as opposed to sort of focusing on the financial profits. That is something that the American economy is not designed to do. Unfortunately, we are not designed to invest in human capital. We're designed to generate as much profit as possible for the people who have demonstrated their ability to generate profit, and that does not always lead to the best outcomes.
No, because they're looking at
But
models,
it's
right?
specifically short-term profits, though.
Well, and it's models.
The stock market runs on short-term profits.
That's true. A CEO will lose his position after a couple of bad quarters, even if he had a good decade before that. And
Right. So there's very little emphasis on uh, trying to maximize internal capital investment in order to improve knowledge, okay, or improve quality,
Or ingenuity.
human quality, right, creativity. There's very
It,
little emphasis, okay, on that because those are more long-term things, and they're not easily quantifiable either.
mm,
And
but they
there's
are, Joe.
emphasis on over the long term they're quantifiable, but not
Hmm. Just
necessarily
look
over the
back.
short term.
Hold on, hold on. Let's just look at it real quick from the standpoint of it is exactly a 180 from what was going on in this country all through the 50s and even the 60s, right? Because you had what happened when uh, we put together, like, let's just say all the men that came back from the war, all right, and they were trained so well because they had to be, because we didn't have the technological innovations. We were much more mechanical, even though we were innovative in the, industrial revolution. They were flying in planes that had literally, my grandfather flew the hump. They had air oxygen lines running through the cabin of the cargo planes, right? And when they were flying that hump, they'd shoot the plane and the planes would blow up because the oxygen was running through inside the cargo plane, right? My grandfather was a mechanic. Those planes would come back. My grandfather was responsible for um, keeping them flying. He could tell by the sound of them coming into land what plane they were because he knew how to keep them flying. That was his job, right? Well, he comes home. He comes home from the war, and he ends up being the chief mechanic on Dorothy 6. Mind you, they didn't have engineers. They didn't call them engineers back then. They were the chief mechanics, right? My grandfather worked on Dorothy 6 in the Duquesne Works in the mill for GE for years, right? And all of his buddies that came back that were so well trained, they went into industry and they had the work ethic, they had the military discipline, and it transferred. And what America did at that point was make sure they took that talent back in, right? Which displaced their wives that were working in the mills while they were gone, which is, not a bad thing. Society was a little different then. But let's not forget that my grandmother was making $6.75 an hour. 80 years before I was making $6.75 an hour. There's your wage stagnation example.
wow.
Anyhow, back to what was going on. We had this civilian conservation corps, right? Or works or whatever it was, that built all the dams and laid all the roads. And there was a responsibility to the public purpose that all of our society rallied around. You were supposed to take care of your community. We were building out America. We were doing things that we had never done before. We were sending men to the moon with frickin' slide rule calculations. I mean, let's be real. It was real. It was real. We weren't, oh, let's take this kid because he got a 4.0, and oh, this guy over here, he's from GE. Let's sit him down because God Almighty, they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. It wasn't like that. It wasn't a corporate pedigree. It was what did we teach you? How did we discipline you? What opportunities did we give you? And how did you perform while we were fighting World War II? And everybody at home was investing in war bonds. Let's tie in some financial, like, how did this work? They had to fund the war through war bonds, right? And they had 7 rounds of war bond raises. And who was paying for that? All of us sitting here, right? And they actually sent Hollywood over to get on the ships and get in the theaters where they could, and they shot the war so that they could bring that footage back. And the producers that did that are, they're not that far gone. I'm blanking right now, but they're like not the generation this time, but like your parents' generation of great movie film directors and producers. Anyway, they showed the American people the film, and the American people bucked up. And every round, people were like, okay, we bought them, but we're going to buy them again. We're saving, Uncle Sam is going to make good on this money. We know that, but they need it to fight that war. And they got buy-in, and there was community, and there was understanding. The American people understood. We need to fund this war. Now, let's be honest here now. We were on the gold standard back then. Things have changed. But of course they're going to change. But what we had back then, people had buy-in. They could trust what they were watching on the news. We didn't have this, people were protected from corporations. If they got sick, if they were being poisoned, all of that, that's all gone. What we've got now are corporations, and they're sucking everything out of the common man, and nobody cares.
Yeah, at least in the late 30s, 40s, and early 50s, we had an economy that was much more geared towards positive, real outcomes than it was towards just creating as much profit for profit holders. It was much less of a plutocracy than it was now. It wasn't perfect, but
no,
the government stepped in many places and decided, this is what we're going to do. We're going to pay to get these things done, and to prevent the negative impacts of sort of inflation or financial speculation. We're either going to regulate, we're going to do antitrust, we might have a price control here and there. The government provided some things at its own cost, at a loss, intentionally, and gave people the opportunity and the motivation to save, to sort of prevent the money from sort of going in every which direction, and sort of pushing out people who weren't able to accumulate income.
And during the Second World War, of course, the role of wage and price controls, was critical.
Mm-hmm.
Huge. And the funds, in other words, the people who were investing in bonds, did see themselves as funding the war, but they were not actually funding the war. The war was being funded by the new money created by the government. But what the war bond program was doing was actually draining money off in order to avoid inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And along with the wage and price controls, the war bond program was extremely effective. When people put the money into savings, that was a leakage from the consumption economy, which was good because the consumer products were not there during the war, because generally production was devoted to the war effort.
Right.
So that's what happened. But
they knew how to do it, right? And the people bought in.
And not only that, there's some very interesting aspects of this. During the war, we got into the use of quality management, the philosophy and techniques. Specifically, E.B. Deming was very, very influential in terms of introduction of these techniques, into government manufacturing. But when the war was over, he and his techniques were farmed out, because the big companies didn't want any part of them for the civilian economy. So for a while, he had a tough time finding work. He ended up in Japan,
Look what
starting
happened
the
there.
quality management movement over there. He and his techniques spread to Toyota and to the other Japanese companies, and they were responsible for the changes in manufacturing which the Japanese were introducing from the end of the war until the 60s and 70s, okay, and 80s. Those were American techniques that we had used, okay, in the Second World War,
I
which
think
our
I,
capitalist businesses didn't want to use after that.
I think it's important for just make one more point, and that is that the American people benefited from an alliance with their government to build the country and to have their standard of living increase dramatically
Following the war, yeah.
and for a good sustained time after,
Yeah,
right?
for a very long time between 1945 and 1970 is kind of a golden age. Okay.
75, yeah, right? 73.
Well,
But
already things were slipping, during the early 70s as the neoliberal philosophy, came into control of things. But
it went upside down, like really upside down, where we were going the other way and everybody started to feel it by the 2000s, right? Really, that was kind of it. But what I'm trying to get at here, the point I'm trying to visualize for everyone is we don't have that now.
oh yeah,
We do not have the
we do.
government wanting to take care of society as a whole and raise them, right? And
Right,
I'm
and we
not
had that coming out of the Second World War. Coming out of the Second World War, it was accepted that it was the responsibility of the government to see that full employment existed in the United States. And it was also the responsibility of the government to control inflation, to have stable prices. And the government at that time took those responsibilities very, very seriously. And I think the government only abandoned those responsibilities, really starting to some degree in Jimmy Carter's time, but then, of course, really under Reagan, okay, in the 1980s, that's when the attitudes started to circulate. That really it was about the market and benefits that were coming from the market, and the best thing for the government to do was to hands off, okay, and do as little as possible. And economic doctrines that developed, which contended, okay, and I think this brings us back to our discussion here, which contended that if the government would stimulate uh, our society through deficit spending, then that wasn't going to work. It was going to have, an immediate effect of, in terms of employment, but perhaps it was going to have some kind of inflationary effect. But in the long run, whatever we gained through deficit spending, we were going to lose a few years later because the models were showing that the economy was going to adjust, okay, and go back to an equilibrium state, which in terms of the models was not a full employment state. It was the Nehru state. And the doctrine of the Nehru started out by basically specifying that the non-accelerating rate, of unemployment was something like 6%. Okay, and
Yeah.
during the Bush administration, uh, it was thought to be 5%. In other words, people were saying 5% was full employment then. Okay, there were some economists who were saying, no, that's nonsense, because in the Second World War, full employment was 1.5%. But somehow people forgot about the history, okay, of the Second World War, because it was uh, they had an incentive, okay, to believe that the government was performing well and the economy was performing well, even if the unemployment rate was 5%.
They
They did not.
trusted the government.
Yeah.
They trusted them because they took care of them.
Well,
They
they
took
weren't
care of them from
taking.
the sand. I'm not talking about paychecks. I'm talking about they made sure they had jobs. They laid roads. People's wages were climbing. Housing was being built. It was affordable. Small businesses, mid-sized businesses, it was flourishing. We trusted one another. There was a rapport there. There was a give and a take.
Yeah, right. In the 50s,
Yeah.
60s, and 70s. Okay, but I'm already up to the 80s, and I'm saying by the 80s, there was not that level of trust in
Mm-mm.
government. There was a lag effect in which the trust in government started to go away slowly, slowly, and then faster and
Well, you
faster.
had the SNL crash,
2000s.
right? The SNL crash really, really hurt. And then, there were subsequent things. But when you start going after when savings and loans go belly up because you don't take care of nobody's watching the hen house and people lost everything. And you're not talking like really wealthy people, you're talking middle America. And then that happens over and over and over again, right?
And the savings and loan crisis was created by the lack of regulation.
Mm-hmm.
If they had
Mm-hmm.
been regulating as they were supposed to have regulated, savings and
I
loan.
sort of have my own sort of pet theory as to why people became not only more distrustful of government, but also more uh, desirous of deregulation, which is that they had this idea that that plutocracy might work for them. As we have someone in the comments, John B, who said that neolib successfully sold the public on the idea that what's good for business is good for you. And John B, I'd like to agree with that 100%. I mean, I think for as long as I can remember, and maybe you guys can chime in if you remember this also. Even in elementary school, you learn about this thing called the American Dream. Which is essentially that if you work hard, you can get lots and lots of money. And, partially because we are not a country where the government is going to stop you from doing that. And I think the natural sort of expectation from that is that people are going to want less regulation, even if it means that it hurts people at the bottom, because they think that they will not be among the people at the bottom. They think that, if you deregulate, they will be among the people who become richer and richer. I think this is a major problem in terms of sort of where the United States can go and what they should be doing moving forward. Like, um, how do you govern and sort of build an economy in a country where everyone thinks that if things are terrible, that won't apply to them and that they'll be able to climb on top of everyone else who is scrambling at the bottom.
Right.
So
So
well
that's
said.
theory. That's a theory which grew and grew and grew. Okay, in popularity from the 80s, to the 90s. Okay, and even into the 2000s, before the crash. But that was not a popular theory back in the 1950s. During the 1950s, Charlie Wilson, who was the president, okay, of General Motors at that time, and who moved into the Eisenhower administration. Okay, I forget exactly the position that he had in the Eisenhower administration, but he was famous for saying, "What's good for General Motors, okay, is good for the country." Okay,
Mhm.
people laughed at him. They literally laughed at him. He didn't persuade anyone. I mean, everybody said, "Oh, he's just a Republican." That's all there is to it. And the Republicans were the minority party then, in spite of the fact that Eisenhower won. That was the period of Democratic dominance in Congress that sort of started in 1954 and did not end until the Gingrich Revolution, of 1994. So that was a long time. It was 40 years. Okay, and the Democrats were dominating Congress for most of that time. Okay, but of course things changed. Okay, because attitudes changed and because people began to develop the idea that they could get rich off the economy, which the neoliberals were building.
Let's not forget that the stock market was under 10,000 in 2002, 3.
Well, the stock market, okay, was under 10,000, but we also have to keep in mind that there was great increases, due to the real estate bubbles that occurred, and the real estate bubble, in terms of the 2000s, what you had was people's houses, were multiplying in value very quickly, and people were cashing in, by borrowing money off the value of their houses.
Yeah, but that
So,
was right. That was directly after. At one point, the market dipped, and I can't remember what it was. I don't know if it might have been Enron and that whole debacle, but the market dipped down below 10,000. And
oh yeah, it did.
and then it boomed, Joe. And then what you're talking about happened. And then we hit 2007 and it went kaboom again. But then it
Uh,
just kept,
right, but there were cycles. Like to some
yeah,
extent, this was happening during the 1990s also.
right,
Uh,
right. But look at where it is now is what I'm trying to say. Look at the exponential growth because of the speculation, right?
oh,
And
I,
the
I completely agree with that. Okay, but
yep,
what I'm trying to say is that during the 1990s, okay, and the 2000s, lots of ordinary people were getting lots of wealth from the housing bubbles
yes, and then they lost it all. The
created.
ordinary folk.
Right.
Some of them lost it all, but some of them, were extremely lucky. Okay, a friend of mine somehow had talent for sensing when things were going to go down. He had an incredible run of luck where his houses kept on going up in value, and he would
Mhm.
sell his house at just the right time,
Mm.
okay, and then he would get into the market again at just the right time, okay, and things would go up again. And he became very very prosperous that way, uh, by playing the housing bubbles in a rather conservative way.
Yes, and
Right.
it depended though on what part of the country and what real estate market, right? Remember when the
Yes, it sure did. He
Northeast
was
went
he
went
was in the
through a mortgage
Washington real
crash?
estate market. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it just depended. I mean, the poor people in Arizona. I've got family members who walked away from their house, just signed the house over to their wife. They made the decision that her credit was going to be ruined, walked away from it, and they lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars because of
Yes.
it.
Yes.
So it
Yep.
depended. But what happened, there were certain cycles, and in my memory, I can go back and trace them because I forgot all about that. But I had family members who had family living up there and lost everything in that downturn. But now the downturns are huge because of all this play that's going on in the macro financial world of capital. And what's happening down below, which is what MMT tries to tie back in, is your disconnect is unbelievably incompetent. How can you be so disconnected from the American people and what they need. I mean, we're all, not all of us, but let's just be honest. Unless you are independently wealthy, right? You can make $200,000 a year. Well, good luck, because if you're single and you carrying a shit ton of student debt and you don't have a house to shelter you from any taxes, right? It's getting eaten up anyway.
Yes.
Right.
That's and if you're not well lucky enough to be making that kind of money and you're sitting down here in your house, which God help everybody who's trying to get a mortgage right now because the rates are going through the roof. Joe, you bought your house when interest rates you told me were in the double digits, right? So your whole
Uh,
time period of paying your
when
mortgage, you're paying all that interest.
when we bought the house that okay, so we had been buying townhouses for a while, and we decided that we wanted to go into a detached house, and we moved into one in Chantilly, Virginia. It was 1983. Okay, and at that time, interest rates were high,
Hmm.
so it was the Paul Volcker period.
Hmm.
Okay, and when we bought our house, the interest rates were 13%.
Yeah. I mean, and let's just
Real.
shine a light on this for just 1 second, because I want to tie this back to MMT. Build Back Better, when it was in the inception of it, not what ended up with this 1.7 bullshit, but
Mm.
the 10 trillion that went to 6 trillion and then went to 3.5. 3.5 was still a joke, but let's just be honest. That was our attempt at reinfusing and putting together the American people and the benefit to the working man, which has not happened for so long.
Yes.
And they stomped on it. And it was on purpose. And I don't care what anybody says from a party line or a political line. Joe and I had followed that all the way through. It was so obvious. There was no way that the capitalists were going to let this happen, because the minute you give the poor and the oppressed and the stagnant waged folk a taste of what is possible, damn, our cheap, desperate labor goes out the window.
Yeah, like we talked about, it used to be the case, that if you put sort of the interest of profit over the interest of the people, they would laugh at you, and and that was that way during World War II, and it slowly, gradually became what we have today. But I'd like to ask you guys, or how do we get back to that cultural moment where individuals thought that what's best for the country was what was best for sort of poor people who needed jobs, people who needed healthcare, people who needed housing. How do we get back to that moment where we put sort of resiliency and real outcomes above corporate profits?
I just say this right flat out. We need an MMT insider to run for president and put all the players in the right places, because like I said earlier that we weren't on, but you are not going to get the mainstream economists who have built their careers and have published papers and written books and are on the inside and play the game from the inside to do a mea culpa and say, hey, you know what? I was wrong. We can fight that loggerheads forever and stay down here in this place where we're educating more people. But people are like, oh, gee, that's great. Well, look at Build Back Better. Look what they did. We've got to get a candidate that's able to win, that has some gravitas, that understands government, that has the respect to run, so that we can put a cabinet together, we can put economic teams together, we can have the influence, and then we can motivate the country to believe in themselves again. Because right now it is every man for themselves. And if January 6th was not a absolute moment of holy crap, what have we done? in leadership, and they're not admitting it. But that's what that was. It's not any longer the minorities. It's not the standard poor, if you will, right? It's everybody now who's feeling this instability, this insecurity, whether it's healthcare or stagnant wages or the predatory lending that has gone on for college education. I mean, that is predatory lending, and people don't understand that history, but it is. I mean, I was in school when Ronald Reagan defaulted on signed government promissory notes of guaranteed student loans. If we couldn't afford to come up with the money, he threw us out of school. And I personally had Pell Grants, and I forget the name of the loan that I had. I was immediately in default because my prior disbursement happened in the spring of the prior year. So my prior federal student loan disbursement was 6 months out. I was immediately in default.
Wow.
Poor and nobody, because you know why? Because my family made $30,000 a year. And that was expected at the time in the mid 80s when everybody was wearing pearls and wanting their, Gucci and their Ralph Lauren and their foreign cars, right? But $30,000 with one kid or more in college, no student loans for you, even though you signed a promissory note. The federal government defaulted on student loans, period. The end.
Wow. So Lisa thinks that we need some, presidential leadership in order to get people to believe in a people's economy. Joe, what
Well,
do you?
right. So I believe in that as well, but I don't think. I think the more fundamental thing that we need to do is to get rid of the influence of money, okay, in politics.
We're running out of time though, Joe. And I love
And
that. And
we
I'm
have a
working with you
show.
on that, but we don't have time.
Yes, okay. We have a show on Thursday. Okay, Lisa's my co-host for that one also, which is devoted to an idea that we probably have to change the slogan. It's a good slogan, I think, but uh, it doesn't really represent fully the idea that we have in mind. Okay, it's dump the incumbents. Okay, is the slogan. Okay, and the name of the show. And what dump the incumbents is about is getting money out of politics by making the money toxic to the candidates who take it. So we're trying to get people to follow rules in how they vote and to not vote for either incumbents or candidates, who are taking big money.
So let me just say one more thing. Because of the time period window that we do not have due to climate change, I mean, let's just be honest, we are about to biologically collapse if we don't do something about that soon.
Well, of
If we
course,
got
that I
if we
agree with that.
got an MMTer in there, we would be able to regulate because of course that's what's going to happen, right? We would be able to drive policy through also doing the dump the incumbents to put enough people in the Congress to have a voting bloc that can do things like not vote for Nancy
Okay,
Pelosi for Speaker of the House,
we're
right?
going to have a problem with respect to regulation. The reason why we're going to have to, I'm probably going to have a problem, okay, with regulation is the Supreme Court is about to intervene again.
So pack the court. I mean, but
Well,
that's what we
we
need.
can't, the point being, we cannot pack the court. We're unlikely to be able to get the MMT candidate that we need to have in there. But even if we did, and even if we got the kind of cabinet that we want to have in there, that's not going to move the country forward unless we have a Congress.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. We have to
What
do
follows
both.
that, we have to do both, right?
We have to do both. But you cannot expect change in the time frame that we have. I mean, we have to keep in the forefront of our minds that we are on borrowed time. I mean, I'm carbon negative. I've been screaming carbon negative for a while. We have to pull both levers.
Yes,
Both.
I certainly agree. We have to pull them both. But the dump the incumbents rule, okay, applies to the president, okay, as well. It applies to the presidency, it applies to the state legislatures, okay, and it applies to the Congress.
But if you
Okay,
don't have a candidate to
positions of
dump,
all kind. Uh, you have to have a candidate that will be taking less money than the incumbent, okay, and that also has the other capabilities, we want that candidate to have at least some understanding that there is a revolution going on in economic thought.
someone's not
That
going to work, Joe. We've
that
got to have it.
particular candidate also has to know that they have to fill their cabinet up with people who have a new understanding, okay, of economics, and that has to extend to getting rid of the Federal Reserve chair, to making sure the Treasury Secretary is the right one,
MMT
to
or
making
tighter.
sure the Council of Economic Advisors is filled with the right people, and that the president of the National Economics Council, okay, is the right one. Uh, so we know that we need all that, but we also have to have a majority in Congress that is big enough to keep the money out of politics. In other words, if the Congress is such that it's created by people voting to get money out of politics, then there's the problem of keeping it out of politics. And if you're going to keep it out of politics, you have to get rid of this Supreme Court some way. You have to pack it. You have to impeach certain people on the Supreme Court. Okay, and you have to make these changes within the next 2 or 3 years. So we need a movement right now because we can't start to seriously work on the climate until we have these political changes.
Yeah, you got to give the people something to believe in. Nobody believe. It's so bad that we can't even get people to understand that if you don't vote, it is a sheer and sure and swift demise. That's
Yes, I
how
know.
disillusioned people are right
I
now.
know. We have a lot of people, who are on the left, okay, as we are, um, who believe, okay, that electoral politics is useless at this point, and that all we can do is mass movements, unionization, and
Mutual aid.
yeah, the general strikes, and that all those kinds of things can bring change. Now we favor all those kinds of things, but
But you can't
know
abandon the electoral piece of it.
we know that alone is not going to bring change. We have to have the right people in Congress who will not be the neoliberal people,
Yeah.
but will be people who want to legislate for the public purpose. And we know that that means they have to base the economic legislation on MMT, certainly. But there are also foreign policy implications. Okay,
Huge.
you cannot try to maintain the view of foreign policy that we're going to have a unipolar world, and that but this country is going to be at the head of that world. That world is not going to work for us to meet the climate emergency. It has to be a multipolar world, and the people have to be pulling together. That means among the first things we have to do is to end the war we have going on now, which is very damaging to the environment.
And the economy and everything else.
Yes, and to
Mhm.
politics, which is distracting us so, and is also splitting up the left movement, because there are some people who are swallowing the garbage about what's going on in Ukraine. They're completely unaware, of Russian history. They're completely unaware of the context of the war. They're completely unaware of the fact that we have pushed the Russians for more than 20 years
into a
and
corner.
have created the situation where they have now pushed back. And
We
to
have,
my mind,
as
they had
go-
little choice.
the government has totally abandoned diplomacy, just like it totally abandoned containment on the pandemic. It's the same thing. So, you know, I believe honestly that we could put a candidate out there, and we don't have to run. We don't have to put them out there as an MMTer. Okay, that's not what they run on. But we need a serious candidate that can take and make a Treasury Secretary, because we've got them in the stable. We know who these people are that we need on leadership committees and
Yes.
in the cabinet and in the economic. I never can remember the name. What do you call it? The Economic Council? The Economic, what do you call it?
Uh,
Council of Economic Advisors, I think.
There you go. There you go.
there's a Council of Economic Advisors,
There it is. There it
and
is.
there's a National Economics Council. The two things are different. The Council, okay, of Economic Advisors is a council, okay, that advises the president, but their scope is strictly economic. Okay, the National Economics Council, okay, is a council whose chair, okay, is an economist who is prominent, okay, in some way, but the members of that council are generally business people, high level people in the administration, industrialists. The only the real economist that's a member of that council is the chair.
Hmm.
Okay, so
However
there are
we
these
however we
two
do it. I mean,
vehicles.
we've got a situation where, Fadl would be great as a special envoy to the UN or even the EU, and work on the what is it? What do they call it? The ICC, um, to come up
The
with an
IPCC, you mean?
IPC, to
Mhm.
pitch and work with as a diplomat. How do we come up with solutions? Right now, what we have is this. I'm just going to say it out loud. We've got the greatest generation in the White House, and they're operating off of Brzezinski foreign policy. And
Oh
you know,
yeah,
the,
circa 1978. They haven't
yeah.
changed their foreign policy since 1978.
And what I'm going to tell you is, I'm out on Twitter on a daily basis and have been for the last 90 days, advocating for diplomacy. And I have been called a paid Putin puppet, an
Yeah, me too. I was
apologist,
called a paid Putin puppet.
all day long. And I'm not afraid to push back on that. And I've got people in my own family who've bought into this whole idea that we need to arm Ukraine. And then when you confront them with the fact that Zelensky said that the only way that this war is ever going to be ended is with diplomacy. Oh my God, these are the same people that watch the Academy Awards and the Grammys and the NFL draft, and televised in was Zelensky, and everybody's like, rah, 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 send them the weapons, woohoo. And they can't even figure out, because they're like this, that the only way that wars are contained and solved, conflict is solved, and we can come together as a world entity that needs to solve this climate crisis. We can't be screwing around with proxy wars, for God's sake.
Absolutely. And in order to stop screwing around, we need a party that has principles, and that means a party that is going to say, if you're going to run under this banner, you have to support certain things and you have to oppose certain things.
We
The
need an
Republicans are
insurgent. We
the
need an
Republicans are
insurgent.
we do, yes, we do. We to completely take over the Democratic Party, because the
Hmm.
Republicans are unfortunately the only party in this country that has principles. We saw how they, you know, destroyed Madison Cawthorn's career just because he said inappropriate things. But meanwhile, the Democrats, ostensibly the party of the workers, let a plutocrat and a oligarch, Joe Manchin, be in their party, simply because they're afraid of losing that seat in West Virginia, even for the shortest amount of time. I think it's fascinating that we never see Republicans running pro-choice Senate candidates in California to try to get that seat. They stick to their guns, and eventually, when they're able to consolidate power, they're able to do what they want with it. When they got, when Trump was the president and they had a Republican Congress, they were able to pass, their tax bill that they had always wanted to do because they had built a coalition, about saying that like this is what's important to us. And when they, were able to nominate Supreme Court justices who were going to be anti-choice, that's what they always wanted, and they built their entire coalition, all of their principles. They said, if you're going to run as a Republican, you have to be anti-choice. You have to support these anti-choice Supreme Court justices, and they didn't care that they lost a few elections in the short term because they had long-term goals. The Democrats don't have long-term goals.
The Democrats sold out in this idea of centrism, and this is the other piece of this puzzle that people have got to wrap their heads around. Centrism was, if you can't beat them, join them. That's what the Democratic Party has done. The Republicans, why do they gerrymander? Because they need the votes. And how do you get your people to vote in your gerrymandered districts? Because if they did what the Democrats did, they'd lose too. They make damn sure that they're in touch with their voters. They gerrymander them based on the values of the Republicans, and they are masters at narrative. And, they bring their people along and they get the buy-in from their voters because they listen to them, because they know they have to get the candidate elected. The Democratic Party shut down the damn state party operation. Why? Because they sold out and they went centrist.
Okay, the secret of the Republicans in getting their stuff done, though, was that they elected a presidential candidate who didn't have any principles, who was a crony capitalist,
who was a demagogue,
and who was willing to make deals with them. In other words, he himself really wasn't, an anti-choice people. He didn't care about choice. What he cared about, was making money, and making deals and dealing with his cronies who would support him.
But who sold
a mafia type operation? But he needed Mitch McConnell.
And you know what?
When the
he
deal
bought them
made with him. The deal Mitch McConnell made with him was that you have to support my Supreme Court choices, and you have to support the anti-abortion stuff.
Yes, and then everybody fell in line.
Support the tax cuts, and then everybody fell in line.
And why did they fall in line, though, Joe? Because their voters believed in them. Why?
Absolutely.
Because they delivered for them for a long time. Now, they got hoodwinked, a lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Okay? And that is what I see now. It's not just liberals or Republicans. They're my damn neighbors. Now, I know which ones are liberals and which ones are Republicans because I saw the yard signs that I never saw in the 7 years that I lived here until the last election that Trump was running in. Okay? And at that point, I realized that, damn, all my friends are Republicans. I'm as left. Now, I am not extreme. I'm an accountant. I worked at a bank. I mean, I'm grounded in I don't even know what I would call myself, but I am definitely left. If somebody's going to put a label on my head, somebody might actually try and label me far left. Although the Republicans try and get me to run on their ticket because they know what my background is, right? But here's the deal. their voters trust them. Why? Because they're smart enough to realize that they're not going to get elected on their waning 40-year-old voting bloc, which is what the Democrats do.
Yes.
They're still counting on the old gang to go in and, quote unquote, pull that lever. Because
Yep.
that's the majority of the registered Democratic voters that are called super voters, which of course I am one. I get all the mailings. I know what's going on inside that camp. They're the same people who are the TV generation who still think when they turn the news on, they're not getting propaganda.
Okay, so we have a very significant question from Sandy Degg, who asks, who is the candidate you have in mind, Joe? And so I'm going to ask it of our panel here. Who is the candidate we have in mind?
Well, I don't know if Jonathan has one because we just like totally smacked him upside the head with this idea. And you know the candidate that you pitched to me, but I think that we all need to talk about and think about the stable of unbelievably qualified and exceptional leaders in the MMT movement. And let that rise up. And it does not have to be those individuals that are constantly out in front. Okay. There are a lot of MMTers out there that have a lot of political clout, that have been in government, that understand the needs that we have. They know that we need regulation. They understand, the climate crisis. They understand all of it, right? There are people within this movement, and I'm telling you right now, we won't even have to worry about money. We just need them to run. We just need somebody to stand up and say, you know what? I'm willing to serve. Not that I want to be president, not that I want to run for president, because who in their right mind would want to do that in this climate? But they need to be willing to serve and understand the crisis that we're in. And we've got some ideas, right? But I don't want to put ideas in folks' heads and let them run off with that. I think that this needs to be a consideration that everybody has input in.
Yes, and I agree with you. Uh, I think we all have to collaborate on thinking through what kind of candidate should represent us all, and we have to start thinking about different people who might be able to accomplish the very tough tasks that we want them to accomplish. Which, by the way, is going to mean they have to have a certain amount of knowledge of things that are important to have.
They're gonna have to have a lot of knowledge of things, because if we get another person in there that somebody else is gonna come in and start playing puppeteer, we're back to where we started. We need somebody with savvy. We need somebody with gravitas. We need somebody who's not going to get all starry-eyed with the glitz and the glamour and the pomp and circumstance and the
We have to
party.
have somebody who knows how the Congress works,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to have somebody who knows how the executive branch works
Yes,
as
absolutely.
well. And yeah, okay,
And they're out there. They're
yeah,
out there.
yeah, they're out there.
I mean, Joe, throw some names out.
Yeah, go for it, Joe. I don't actually know of any viable candidates who I think are properly MMT informed, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Not sitting reps. That's not what we were thinking.
Yeah, we were not thinking sitting reps. Okay, I'll throw out one name just for kicks.
Just start the discussion. Throw one out.
Okay, so my name is James K. Galbraith.
I like that one.
He has congressional
Great.
experience. He has experience in the executive branch. He knows a lot, okay, of MMT, though he would probably characterize himself more as an institutional economist, as part of the institutional school, okay, of economics. Uh, but he knows a lot of MMT, and for years has been a sponsor of MMT people who has gotten MMT people into high places. So he punches the MMT ticket actually pretty darn well. He
And his
punches.
father was a diplomat, right?
His father was the head of the Price and Wage Stabilization Board. Okay, in World War II, he was responsible for the price controls. He was the one who did the job of stopping inflation during the Second World War.
Wow, we've got somebody
He
whose
was
dad knew how to do it.
also he was also president of the American Economics Association. Okay, at one time, he also wrote lots of popular books. Okay, in economics, they were bestsellers. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but when they came out, uh, but Jamie.
Hang on, Joe. Would you like Jamie to run for Senate? Is that what you're saying?
No,
President.
I'm saying I would like Jamie to run for president.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to stop playing around. We need somebody to drive.
He's a person of he's a person of honor, integrity, and imbued with ideas of the public purpose, okay, in public service. And he knows everything that the kind of candidate we want should know. Okay, now whether we can get him into a position where there'd be any popular way for him, I don't know how to do that. I'm not a marketer.
You don't need to be a marketer. If the goods are there, we put it together. Then you just hire the campaign staff. He would need to run on the ticket. He would need to run on the Democratic ticket because we have to do this seriously. We have to capture the imagination and the hope of the entire voting bloc that is entrenched in that party. We've got to motivate all of the independents. We've
Right.
got to bring in the unregistered voters. We have to put this together so that we can show people that there is a reason to have some hope, because I'm telling you right now, there's not a lot of it left. There's not.
Right. Okay. And of course, he is now 70 years old.
It's fine. He's not 80.
And we don't know, okay, if he would want to run.
We would have to convince him that he is serving the people, not whether or not he wants to run. The question is, are you willing to serve?
Fine. We don't
Mm-hmm.
know, okay, if he would be willing to serve. Okay. And willing to go through the electoral process, okay, in order to serve. Okay. So anyway, he's only one candidate.
And there's more. There
we
are more.
mentioned. But he's an example of a candidate who would fit. Okay, there are others, but there are not so very many who have the congressional experience and the executive branch experience both.
And known in the houses of government, right?
Yes,
Known. He's
have
got a
a wide
reputation and a
range of
pedigree.
contacts, wide range of contacts. Okay, in government, gained over many years.
So anyway, there you go. We fixed the problem, Jonathan, or at least we think we're trying to.
Yeah.
How do you like that, Jonathan? What do you think about that candidate?
I think Jamie would be sort of excellent in that position. I think the challenge is sort of creating a mass movement of people who understand what needs to be done and are no longer willing to accept compromises on building a sustainable, equitable economy. I feel like for the last 4 or 5 election cycles, there has always been this refrain that uh, at least the Democrats are a little bit better than the Republicans, and that's why you should vote for them. And what that hasn't gotten us anywhere.
And we're out of time.
We have to be bolder. We have to demand, what we demand. It's like I said before. The Republicans were a party, more or less of just a couple of issues, but they were very strict about them. You had to toe the line on these issues if you wanted to run on that ticket. And even once Trump got in office, even though he didn't care about those issues, like they made him support the justices that they wanted in order to pass the tax bill that they both wanted, both him and Mitch McConnell. And I think the people have to start saying, I'm not going to vote for a candidate just because he's a Democrat, or she's a Democrat. I am only going to vote for a candidate who is willing to go big on climate change, sort of reject, plutocracy in terms of, we want to build a people's economy that is focused on real outcomes rather than on maximizing profits. And I think, we have to talk to people and sort of let them know what's at stake and try to educate them and empower them and let them know that there are other people willing to sort of hold out their vote with them and really make them understand that you cannot trust a party that is going to compromise, all of the things that its voters care about. Even if there are some ostensible, tiny short-term gains to be had from having a Democratic president, it is not worth it in the long run to destroy the planet and to impoverish the economy.
We are out of the long run. Number one. Number two, Bernie came out of nowhere. And why was he successful? Because he was speaking a language that people were thirsty for, that made perfect sense. He didn't lie about anything. He was respectable. He had integrity, right? What can happen with the right candidate is that messaging can be packaged. It can be packaged, it can be delivered, and if it is delivered correctly, people will hear it. And if I'm running this campaign, if it were me, if I were behind the scenes pulling the strings, we are out of time. There is no window to address climate change in another 6 years from now. You announce any minute. As soon as you can announce that you're running after you open up an exploratory committee, where we are right now, the minute you can, you need to. And you need to lead with some really poignant, honest, real talking points. We are out of time. We have to go to carbon negative. Here's how we're going to do that. We need to embrace diplomacy as a country. We have to go to a multipolar world where we work together on climate change. We work together on, you've got these resources and you are this far along in how to get those raw minerals out of the ground, and we're going to help work with you to make sure we do that in the most climate friendly way. We don't have time for the greatest generation tin soldier, let's go to World War III gang, because they're demented. That is the kind of bold message that we've got to put out there. Because honest to God, I know we have to compartmentalize this crap, but we are out of time. And if I sound like this is over the top, I have a 28-year-old daughter and I have a 14-year-old son, and I am 56 years old. And I have been in politics for as long as I can remember, all the way back to 9 years old, watching the Watergate hearings. We are out of time. We don't have time to run a model for the next 6 years. We need a leader, and we need him now. And we have to unite the clans, so to speak. There is no time for despair. That was Bernie. There is no time to be disillusioned because somebody has to rise out of this to run the kind of campaign and to be able to deliver on what needs to happen and has all the pieces in play and has a circle of people around them who already know that we've got to work on a unipolar world. We have to collaborate. We cannot play toy soldiers. Ballistic bullshit. We're already going to die. What are you going to do? Push the button a couple of years sooner? That sounds like what's going on Washington, in Washington on the Hill. That's what I see.
Yeah, that's what I see too. I can't see. I don't understand how some of the more progressive members of Congress could simply have gone along with the Ukraine stuff. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Come on, Joe, it's the Mick. You can see this. You just don't want to see it. This is the Mick. This
No,
is a bot.
I know it's the Mick, but I still don't see why it pulled along every single Democrat. I mean, even Barbara Lee.
Because they watch
Come on.
TV and they think it's real. It's the propaganda machine.
I tend to agree with Lisa on this one. I think that even progressives have their even people who are progressive about domestic issues will still believe certain neoliberal international corporatist sort of lies about international
Yeah,
politics.
I know, but in the case of Barbara Lee, she was the only one to vote against the authorization of
Oh, they're being
the
held
Iraq War.
captive. Joe, they're being held
I
captive.
can't explain why she changed.
It's hostage. We're talking about a security state, and you do not go against the American government if you are representative of it when we have made a decision to run a proxy war for the first time out in public. I mean, come on, this is unprecedented. You fall in line. Just like you fall in line and you never even tweet about your own Medicare for All bill after you introduce it and allow Richie Neal to sit on it.
Well, she's another matter.
No, she's
Health
not. They're
insurance
all
is
there.
another matter. She is not a Barbara Lee.
No, but Barbara Lee,
Not a
even Barbara
Rashida Lee.
Lee is working with the establishment now because for whatever reason, this is what we all got to do. I mean, there
She
are
always
influences.
worked with the establishment, like with Nancy Pelosi. She's always been friends, with Nancy Pelosi. But um, I've never known her to knuckle under like this.
I have never seen every single politician fall in line behind a war decision. Even Bernie. Come on.
Behind
Even Bernie.
$40 billion appropriation,
Yeah, even Bernie.
$40 billion appropriation for Ukraine, when
For a proxy war.
they're talking poverty, about certain things the American people really need. Oh, we don't have the money for this. We don't have the money for that. We don't have. And then $40 billion to Ukraine, thrown out of the window.
Yep.
And then you tell them that they're to fight to the last Ukrainian, but we're not going to open up diplomatic channels and come to the table? Well, so okay, wait a second. Let's just put two and two together because I know this is so crazy that people can't see it. You are to fight to the last Ukrainian, and we will not give you any diplomacy. And Zelensky comes out and says the only way that this war is going to end is with a diplomatic solution. So wait a second. I need a diplomatic solution. The answer was, you are to fight till the last Ukrainian.
It's crazy.
Genocide? Really? Really?
The Russians are not quite ready to negotiate.
I don't know about that, Joe. We're the ones that pulled away.
We're the
We
ones,
know what they want.
we're the ones
We
that
pretended
pulled
that,
away. But right now, they want to complete the conquest of the Donbass. And they
well,
want
yeah,
to get
because those are their people that originally were in their borders that got shoved out into the Ukraine
right,
and
but they
then
want
have
to
been
get
persecuted.
to, okay, as far west, okay, as Odessa as well, because they want to control that
It's not
particular
new.
port.
That's not new.
I don't think that they're going to agree to negotiate until they have control over all these areas. Now, then they might agree to negotiate.
Well, let's just be real about this. Why did we not? Why did we have to go to war? I think we all understand this. The economy was in the shitter, and what do they always do? They crank up the mic to stimulate the economy? No, to stimulate more money for the corporate capital macro.
Hey guys, I gotta head out pretty soon, but it was a great conversation.
It was a wonderful conversation.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, and for coming, and thank you for the conversation. It
Yeah, you're
was a
welcome.
conversation that flowed very nicely, I thought.
Yeah, great episode. All right, I will talk to you guys both soon. I'm looking forward to coming back in a couple months, possibly.
Okay, and we will look forward to having you.
Very much so.
All right, thank you, Joe.
Bye,
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Bye.
So there you have it.
Okay.
We went everywhere, Joe. Foreign policy, history, World War II.
We have foreign policy tomorrow, also, because we have the Regis Tremblay interview,
Hmm.
okay, which is completed already, but the program is going to be commentary on it. Okay, so Regis Tremblay, okay, if people don't know, is a filmmaker to find out the truth about what was going on in Russia, okay, in Ukraine back in 2016, I believe. And he settled in Yalta, okay, in the Crimea, to find out, uh, uh, what was going on. And he's been staying there since, okay, and visiting also Ukraine to find out what's been going on there. And I had a wonderful conversation with him last Thursday. Uh, that's actually a Kerberos Media chat. We'll release it actually sometime, but during the day tomorrow. But uh, I'm going to replay it in our discussion tomorrow evening, uh, so we all can analyze, okay, and comment on it. And I think a lot of it is going to be it's going to be a revelation to many of you. But anyway, for tonight, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for all the comments. And thank you very much for staying. Okay, and Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. This was a great discussion.
It was
Although
very
we did sort of get off of low for long and
yes, we did.
high for long. But I mean, it all ties in because it's so much more than just the interest rates, right? That's the important piece of the puzzle.
Well, what to do about the interest rates, is an important piece of the puzzle. But we'll get into the interest rates, okay, at another time as well, because, okay, when I do my inflation presentation, which will probably be sometime over the next month, I'll be talking about the zero interest rate policy as well. And we'll be going over some of the same things that we started to go over tonight. But anyway, tomorrow night is going to be about foreign policy. And again, but thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll be joining us tomorrow.
Love you guys.
We certainly do.
Bye, Bonnie. I didn't even say hi to Bonnie tonight.
Hi.
Good night, sweetheart. Good night, Joe.
Yeah.
I miss you too. All right, guys. Talk to you later.
Take it
Bye-bye.
easy.
Bye bye.
Okay. So is that good?
Yeah, that's excellent.
Okay.
Very interesting. Jeez.
Oh, by the way, I haven't turned off yet, so I should turn off.
Can I go back with you?
Just a second. Good night again, everybody.